Kosisochukwu was bleeding on the cold, sterile porcelain tiles of the secondary guest bathroom exactly 14 days after surgeons had sliced through her abdomen to deliver her third daughter. She did not scream. She did not beg for help. She had learned over the 6 long, exhausting years she had lived under Bamidele's increasingly oppressive roof that screaming only made the cruelty significantly sharper. What Bamidele did not know, what he himself would not learn for another 3 agonizing months, was that the sprawling Asaba estate he was currently parading around in, the fleet of luxury vehicles parked in the imported gravel driveway, and the very corporate chairman's seat he occupied at Vanguard Horizon all belonged entirely and legally to her. The physical reality of her immediate situation demanded urgent medical attention, but she forced her body to remain entirely still against the unforgiving floor. The heavy, lingering scent of chlorhexidine antiseptic that clung stubbornly to her skin from the extended hospital stay hung heavy in the damp air, mingling violently with the undeniable metallic stench of fresh blood pooling slowly on the Rome. White grout lines. The porcelain pressed a bitter, unyielding chill against her bare thighs, sending sharp electric shivers up her spine that she forced herself to suppress by biting down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted fresh copper. She focused her breathing, slowing it down to a deliberate, measured rhythm to prevent her vision from blacking out at the edges. From the floor above, drifting down through the polished brass air conditioning vents, came the smooth, arrogant, and carelessly loud notes of a saxophone playing a light jazz composition. The music was deliberately turned up, layered beneath the shrill, careless laughter of Talani. The sickly, sweet synthetic scent of Talani's cheap vanilla body mist had already begun to seep under the heavy mahogany doorframe, acting as a suffocating atmospheric invasion of Kosisochukwu's temporary miserable sanctuary. The vanilla clashed with the smell of iron and antiseptic, creating an olfactory nightmare that perfectly mirrored the complete collapse of her domestic life. Kosisochukwu closed her heavy eyes and visualized the foundational legal documents of Vanguard Horizon, currently locked securely in a fireproof steel vault in a bank on Victoria Island. 6 years ago, she had been the most ruthless and effective real estate magnate in the Southern Commercial District. She had possessed a terrifying, almost supernatural instinct for aggressive market fluctuations and a rock-solid reputation for closing impossible land deals that left older, deeply experienced men staring at their signed contracts in absolute disbelief. She remembered the early days of her career, the intense smell of wet red earth and diesel exhaust, standing on dusty construction plots in the blinding midday sun, arguing fiercely with tough foremen who learned quickly to never underestimate her quiet demeanor. She had built an empire from dirt and concrete, transforming raw, untamed land into thriving commercial arteries. When she married Bamidele, she had quietly and methodically liquidated her own massive portfolio of commercial properties to secretly fund the inception of Vanguard Horizon. She had actively protected her new husband's intensely fragile masculine ego by officially naming him the chief executive officer and the exclusive public face of the enterprise, while she retained absolute legal and financial ownership of every single corporate share and holding entity. She had voluntarily stepped back into the silent shadows, surrendering her own hard-fought public identity to give him a brilliant golden kingdom to rule, believing completely that a man who felt powerful and respected would naturally become a generous and fiercely protective husband. She had been entirely and catastrophically incorrect. She had handed a fully loaded weapon to a man who did not know how to aim, and now she was actively bleeding on the bathroom floor from his reckless stray bullets. The sacrifice had not cultivated gratitude, it had merely fertilized a monstrous, unchecked arrogance. She had constructed a beautiful, elaborate corporate stage for him, and he had immediately used his newfound platform to belittle the architect. Upstairs in the expansive master suite, Bamidele was pouring himself a generous, heavy measure of imported single malt whiskey that cost exactly $3,000 a bottle. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling tempered glass windows looking out over the sprawling, meticulously manicured lawns of the Asaba estate, swelling with the profound, unearned pride of a man who believed he had conquered the brutal world through his own sheer brilliance. He watched the estate gardeners trimming the imported hedges in the fading afternoon light and smiled a tight, self-satisfied smile. He signed the heavy corporate checks. He commanded the silent, intimidated boardrooms in Ota. He dictated the harsh, aggressive terms of multi-million-dollar mining extraction contracts. He truly believed the massive empire was the inevitable natural result of his own sweat and superior intellect. He had completely and conveniently erased the memory of the quiet, strategic woman downstairs who had architected the entire complex financial structure of his life. He was not a self-made titan of industry. He was merely a highly paid, deeply delusional employee living completely inside an elaborate corporate illusion sponsored entirely by the wife he was currently leaving to bleed on a cold bathroom floor. Bamidele required the illusion to survive. If he ever looked too closely at the financial ledgers, he would have to acknowledge his own profound mediocrity, and his ego was structurally incapable of bearing that specific terrifying weight. Tolani lounged carelessly on the imported Italian leather sofa in the exact center of the master bedroom, dragging her freshly manicured fingers across the expensive, unblemished upholstery. She was wearing Kosisochukwu's custom-fitted silk dressing gown. The delicate, fragile fabric dragged slightly on the polished marble floor, sweeping carelessly over the heavy hand-woven wool carpets that Kosisochukwu had painstakingly selected from a luxury catalog in London during her difficult first pregnancy. Tolani did not know and did not care about the history of the house, the origin of the silk, or the invisible, crushing financial scaffolding that held the entire luxurious structure up. She only cared that the handsome man pouring the dark whiskey had a platinum credit card and a profound, desperate willingness to spend it on her to validate his own masculinity. Bamidele turned to look at her, admiring the shallow, purely transactional validation she so easily provided. In his deeply flawed mind, a powerful man was naturally entitled to beautiful things, and Tolani was simply another luxury acquisition to be publicly displayed and privately enjoyed, a physical breathing testament to his unmatched success. The contrast between the two women was the exact twisted metric Bamidele used to measure his own worth. Downstairs was the legitimate mother of his children, broken, exhausted, and physically compromised by the dangerous act of attempting to give him a male heir. Upstairs was a woman whose only burden was maintaining her physical appearance, entirely unbothered by the heavy, complex realities of sacrifice, loyalty, or endurance. Bamidele actively chose the cheap illusion of perfection over the heavy reality of devotion because his entire existence was built on an illusion. He could not tolerate looking at Kosisochukwu because her very presence, her silent, terrifying endurance, was a constant, unforgiving mirror accurately reflecting the absolute truth of his own profound inadequacy. Footsteps heavy and highly deliberate echoed sharply on the polished marble stairs leading down to the ground floor. The distinct sound of Bamidele's custom Italian leather shoes striking the hard stone felt like a heavy mechanical metronome counting down to an inevitable execution. The brass handle of the guest bathroom door turned slowly, the mechanism clicking loudly in the confined, silent space. The door swung open violently, pushing the heavy, sickening vanilla scent back out into the long hallway. Bamidele stood blocking the doorway, holding his crystal glass loosely in his right hand, looking down at his bleeding wife with an expression of profound, undisturbed disgust. He did not quickly kneel beside her to ask if she desperately needed a doctor. He did not reach for a fresh white towel from the heated rack. He did not offer his strong hand to pull her up from the freezing, contaminated tiles. He simply stared at the bright red blood on the floor as if it were an intentional, calculated insult to his pristine, carefully controlled environment. "You are a broken, entirely useless machine, Kosi," he said, his voice flat and completely devoid of anything resembling basic human warmth or rudimentary empathy. 3 long pregnancies, 3 useless, weak girls, and now look at you exactly as you are. You cannot even manage the basic fundamental functions of your own body." He took a slow, deeply indulgent sip of his expensive whiskey, letting the cold, heavy silence stretch between them, allowing the cruel words to fully penetrate the damp air. "You are simply taking up space in a house that requires absolute perfection," he continued, his gaze moving slowly from her face to the blood on the tiles. "Even a common, uneducated street hawker selling yams in the dust or a basic, illiterate housemaid has more actual utility and inherent value than you do right now. Clean yourself up immediately. You are severely embarrassing the aesthetic of my home." Kosisochukwu did not cry. The tears that might have easily come years ago when the marriage was still a living, breathing thing were entirely absent, replaced by a cold, hard, terrifying clarity. The blood retreated rapidly from her extremities, leaving her fingers completely numb and stiff against the smooth porcelain sink pedestal. Her heartbeat moved violently out of her chest and pounded heavily in her ears, completely drowning out the light jazz music that continued to play endlessly from the upstairs speakers. Her jaw locked with such immense physical force that a single thick, prominent vein pulsed visibly at her left temple. She tasted the old familiar copper tang at the back of her dry throat, a bitter metallic reminder of her own extreme physical vulnerability that aggressively demanded she swallow her pride and remain absolutely perfectly silent. She simply stared straight ahead, focusing entirely on his polished leather shoes, memorizing the exact specific shade of the expensive imported leather. The cruel words did not break her in the way he so desperately intended. They landed instead directly on the final remaining frayed thread of her affection for him, snapping it cleanly, permanently, and without any residual hesitation. For years, she had actively justified his growing coldness as the unavoidable natural stress of corporate leadership. She had passively accepted his blatant, careless affairs as the unfortunate, inevitable side effect of a powerful man aggressively demanding an outlet for his massive ambition. She had lied to herself, claiming that patience would eventually yield respect. But in that specific, precise moment, looking at his polished Italian leather shoes positioned just inches from her bleeding, compromised state, the grand, elaborate illusion dissolved entirely. She realized with terrifying mathematical precision that he was not just unfaithful or temporarily distracted. He was actively, enthusiastically attempting to murder her core dignity to validate his own absolute depravity. He needed her to be entirely worthless, so his monumental betrayal could feel entirely justified in his own mind. Some brutal betrayals break a heart, leaving the helpless victim weeping and desperate for closure or a useless apology. Others forge the broken heart into a weapon of absolute, uncompromising destruction. Kosisochukwu was no longer a victim seeking an apology. She was a senior creditor recognizing that a massive, high-interest debt was now severely overdue. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of his heavy footsteps slowly recede down the long hallway back toward the stairs, and began the silent, complex, mathematical calculation of his total ruin. The woman who had loved Bamidele died on that cold bathroom floor, leaving only the architect of Vanguard Horizon behind. It took Kosisochukwu exactly 42 agonizing minutes to pull her broken body up from the freezing porcelain tiles of the secondary guest bathroom. Her core muscles having been brutally severed by the surgical blade less than 2 weeks prior and poorly healed in the stressful environment, screamed in silent, furious protest as she gripped the sharp edge of the heavy marble countertop. She washed the drying blood from her thighs using a stiff white cotton guest towel and freezing cold tap water, watching the pale pink diluted fluid circle the polished steel drain with a detached clinical fascination. The immense physical pain was completely blinding, but she actively welcomed the sharp, undeniable sensation. It anchored her firmly to the harsh present reality, preventing her exhausted, traumatized mind from drifting into the useless, indulgent territory of self-pity. She systematically cleaned the floor, leaving absolutely no physical trace of her vulnerability behind. She would not allow Bamidele the profound satisfaction of returning to a visible, lingering wound. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared, the heavy gray rain clouds gathering ominously over the Asaba skyline, the massive wrought iron gates of the estate swung open with a heavy metallic groan. Madame Wuraola stepped out of her hired transport vehicle, moving with the aggressive, undisputed entitlement of a woman who genuinely believed she owned the very air her successful son breathed. The violently clashing sense of her arrival preceded her down the long, polished hallway, serving as a warning of her impending presence. The deep, earthy smell of stale palm oil and wood smoke, carried all the way from her village kitchen, warred aggressively with the cheap synthetic lavender soap she applied in thick, wasteful layers to mask her origins. She walked directly past Kosisochukwu, who was slowly making her way down the wide corridor, holding her healing abdomen with one hand. Wuraola did not offer a basic, customary greeting. She did not ask about the fragile health of the newborn female child sleeping in the nursery. Her eyes simply swept over Kosisochukwu with the practiced cold dismissal of a wealthy, arrogant landlord looking at a destitute tenant who was 3 months behind on rent. Tolani descended the sweeping main staircase a few minutes later, bringing the suffocating scent of vanilla down into the foyer. She was still wearing Kosisochukwu's custom-imported silk dressing gown. The delicate, fragile fabric dragged slightly on the polished floor, sweeping carelessly over the hand-woven wool carpets. "Good morning, Mama," Tolani said, her voice dripping with artificial, calculated sweetness, as she poured herself a tall glass of fresh orange juice from the massive double-door refrigerator. Wuraola beamed, her face stretching into a wide, approving smile that pushed her cheeks up into tight, hard balls. "Good morning, my true daughter," Wuraola replied, deliberately emphasizing the title to ensure it echoed down the silent hallway where Kosisochukwu stood perfectly still in the shadows. A true daughter knows exactly how to give a prominent family strong, healthy male heirs. A woman who only produces weak girls is just a temporary tenant waiting for her lease to naturally expire. "You will give my son a king, and you will wear whatever you please in this house because you have clearly earned the absolute right to rule it." The morning exchange was not merely a display of casual cruelty. It was a calculated, transactional negotiation, operating under the thin guise of traditional family values. Wuraola was expertly weaponizing the cultural demand for male children to secure her own immediate financial comfort and elevate her status. She did not actually care about Tolani as a living, breathing person. She did not even truly care about securing a biological grandson to carry on the family name. She cared only that a new, severely insecure woman in the house would be desperate enough to purchase her maternal approval at any exorbitant cost. Wuraola operated not as a nurturing mother, but as a cynical, ruthless merchant selling highly priced, fraudulent tickets to a domestic throne that did not actually exist. Later that afternoon, when the heavy estate was perfectly quiet and Bamidele was locked securely inside his home office, reviewing mining contracts, Wuraola pulled Tolani into the walk-in pantry, completely out of sight of the domestic staff. The pantry smelled of imported saffron and dried stockfish, a perfect physical representation of the wealth they were currently attempting to divide. The older woman's voice dropped to a conspiratorial, hissing whisper. "My son listens exclusively to me," Wuraola muttered, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway to ensure they were entirely alone. "But the powerful ancestors need to be properly and respectfully appeased if you are to permanently take the highly coveted position of the first wife. The respected women in my family wear pure solid gold for such sacred transition ceremonies to signify their absolute worth. A heavy necklace, perhaps, from the exclusive jewelers on Victoria Island. Provide this substantial tribute, and I will personally ensure Bamidele signs the legal divorce papers before the heavy rains stop." Tolani, entirely desperate to permanently secure the billionaire lifestyle and decisively eliminate her rival, nodded, eagerly promising to procure the heavy gold by the end of the current week. By midday the following day, the grand estate saw another completely unexpected arrival. Tolani had gone to the luxury salon to maintain her expensive extensions, leaving the house briefly empty of her suffocating vanilla presence. The heavy oak front doors opened to admit Ihuoma, She was significantly older than Talani, dripping in heavy oud perfume that smelled of burnt precious wood and imported expensive spices. Solid 24-karat gold bangles clinked loudly at her wrists as she handed her authentic designer handbag to a visibly confused uniformed maid. Wuraola intercepted her in the main formal lounge, her face lighting up with the exact same rehearsed maternal joy she had shown Talani 24 hours earlier. Wuraola guided Ihuoma to the center velvet sofa, settling in intimately beside her. The script was identical, but the required price of admission had substantially increased to match the visible wealth of the new applicant. Ihuoma, my beautiful true daughter Wuraola, purred, stroking the younger woman's hand with calculated fake affection. Bamidele is completely exhausted by his empty, useless marriage to a woman who cannot provide a male heir. But to push out a stubborn, deeply rooted tree, one needs a very strong, expensive machine. My village church desperately needs a new vehicle for the expanding ministry. A luxury sports utility vehicle would show the entire congregation that my son's new wife is a woman of immense substance and deep piety. Fulfill this spiritual duty, and the title of Mrs. Bamidele is yours permanently and undeniably. Madame Wuraola truly believed she was a masterful, brilliant strategist, manipulating foolish, desperate girls for her own quiet, unchecked enrichment. She thought of the dusty, corrugated iron roofs of her village, the persistent smell of wood smoke, and the decades of grinding, exhausting poverty, and she smiled inwardly, believing she had finally outsmarted the entire world. She failed entirely to realize the fragile, collapsing geometry of her own massive deceit. She was attempting to safely occupy two different aggressive realities simultaneously, making identical, exclusive promises to two ruthless women whose only shared trait was their blinding ambition. Wuraola thought she was weaving a masterpiece of deception, but she was merely constructing a very tall, very unstable gallows entirely from the thick planks of her own avarice. Borrowed power always carries an exorbitant hidden interest rate, and Wuraola was happily borrowing against a violent, explosive future she did not legally or practically own. As the weeks went by, the unspoken tension inside the Asaba estate thickened into something almost physical, pressing heavily against the walls like suffocating humidity before a violent tropical storm. One particular afternoon, Chizoba arrived at the estate unannounced, carrying a basket of fresh fruit for her sister. Kosisochukwu's younger sister possessed absolutely none of her quiet, terrifying restraint. She walked into the expansive, air-conditioned living room just in time to see Talani snapping her freshly manicured fingers at Kosisochukwu, demanding that she clean up a spilled glass of imported red wine from the pristine white marble floor. Chizoba dropped her heavy leather handbag, the thud echoing loudly in the large room. Her jaw locked with a loud, audible click. A single thick vein pulsed violently at her temple. Heat climbed rapidly from her stiff collar into her dark hairline, flushing her skin with pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward, her hands curling into tight fists, fully prepared to drag Talani out of the air-conditioned house by her expensive hair extensions and throw her onto the hot gravel driveway. Kosisochukwu moved faster than her healing-compromised body should have physically allowed. She intercepted her furious sister, gripping Chizoba's wrist with terrifying, unyielding strength. Her hands were as cold as the marble floor beneath their feet. Her expression remained utterly blank, devoid of any panic or anger. "Let me go," Chizoba whispered, her voice trembling violently with suppressed rage as she struggled against the iron grip. "She is wearing your clothes. She is drinking your wine. I will kill her right here on this floor." Kosisochukwu did not raise her voice. She looked right past her struggling sister, observing Talani, who was smirking triumphantly from the center of the leather sofa, assuming she had completely broken the spirit of the former wife. "Do not ever interrupt an enemy when they are actively digging their own grave," Kosisochukwu said, her voice dropping to a glacial, steady whisper that carried absolutely no emotion. The words did not immediately calm Chizoba, but the terrifying emptiness in her older sister's eyes forced her to stop struggling. Chizoba realized in that exact moment that Kosisochukwu was not a victim enduring humiliation. She was an apex predator patiently watching her prey wander blindly into a reinforced steel cage. Kosisochukwu understood that Talani's current arrogance was simply the necessary fuel required to permanently destroy Bamidele. If Chizoba attacked Talani now, it would only give Bamidele an excuse to play the victim and initiate a messy public divorce on his own terms. Kosisochukwu required absolute perfect silence to complete the architecture of his ruin. Revenge is a dish best served not cold, but with meticulous, undeniable documentation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, inside the heavily air-conditioned glass tower of a major international bank, an entirely different and far more destructive conversation was taking place. Bamidele sat in a plush leather executive chair across from the regional bank manager. The office smelled of expensive, polished wood, cold circulating air, and the subtle metallic scent of massive wealth. He was systematically signing a thick stack of legal documents to secure a massive, high-interest personal loan. He intended to use the heavily leveraged funds to purchase a luxury penthouse for Talani, cementing his status as an omnipotent provider and a true titan of industry. He confidently and carelessly offered his executive shares in Vanguard Horizon as absolute collateral. The bank manager, a man who had spent 20 years evaluating risk, smiled warmly, pushing the final page across the polished mahogany desk for Bamidele's signature. The approval process was completely instantaneous. There was no hesitation, no request for further documentation. Bamidele signed his name with a heavy flourish, stood up, and shook the manager's hand. He walked out of the massive glass bank feeling like a god among mortal men, completely untouchable in his financial supremacy. What Bamidele could not possibly have known, as he proudly signed his name in thick black ink across the bottom of the multi-million naira loan agreement, was that the regional bank manager had received a direct encrypted phone call exactly 10 minutes before he walked into the expansive lobby. The calm, steady voice on the other end of the secure line had been Kosisochukwu. Her instructions to the bank manager had been precise, absolute, and completely unyielding. Give him the maximum loan, she had ordered, her voice devoid of any hesitation. Accept the corporate shares without question. Do not warn him of the interest rates. Let him take as much toxic debt as he desires. Let him completely hang himself with his own blinding arrogance. Bamidele walked out into the blinding afternoon sun toward his imported car, believing he had comprehensively outsmarted the global financial system. He thought true power resided in the aggressive stroke of an expensive pen on a loan document. He believed that because his signature authorized the transfer of funds, he was the absolute master of his domain. He did not realize that real ultimate power is entirely invisible. True power does not humbly sit in a leather chair and ask a bank manager for massive loans. True power approves them from the absolute shadows, dictating the terms before the borrower even enters the building. Bamidele was aggressively celebrating a monumental victory in a war he had already completely lost. He was an insect, trapped perfectly in hardening amber, admiring the beautiful golden light, completely unaware that he could no longer move his limbs. His arrogance had entirely blinded him to the basic fundamental mechanics of his own corporate existence. He had forgotten that the woman he left bleeding on the bathroom floor was the same woman who had built the bank he just walked out of. That exact night, long after the sprawling Asaba estate had finally surrendered to the heavy, oppressive silence of the early hours, Kosisochukwu began the meticulous, highly calculated process of her own physical relocation. The persistent seasonal rain had started to fall again, drumming a steady, rhythmic beat against the imported slate tiles of the massive roof. But inside the walls, the air was thick and entirely still. She did not announce her departure from the expansive master suite. She did not throw designer clothes into expensive leather suitcases in a tearful, predictable rage. She did not leave a dramatic handwritten note on the polished mahogany bedside table to articulate her profound pain. Moving with the silent, absolute precision of a forensic investigator clearing a contaminated site, She systematically transferred her essential belongings down the long, dark shadows of the corridor to the absolute smallest guest room, located on the isolated north wing of the estate. The sensory contrast between the two distinct physical spaces was absolute and entirely unforgiving. The sprawling master suite she was officially abandoning smelled heavily of Bamidele's expensive, imported sandalwood cologne and the rich, untouched Turkish wool carpets that silently absorbed the low, constant hum of the process. Central air conditioning. It was a room designed specifically for a king who had stolen his crown. The narrow, isolated guest room she now quietly claimed as her own solitary domain smelled faintly of cheap industrial lemon floor wax and the stale, dry dust trapped permanently in stiff Ankara fabric curtains that had not been drawn open in over 6 months. The single mattress was brutally firm and entirely unyielding, resting on a simple, untreated wooden frame that creaked slightly under her weight, but, to her exhausted, compromised spine, it felt exactly like the solid, impenetrable foundation of a reinforced military fortress. She was no longer a wife sharing a marital bed. She was a commanding general occupying a strategic bunker. She methodically transformed the narrow, suffocating room into a clandestine, highly secure operations center. A heavy oak desk, previously used by the domestic staff, was dragged in to replace the decorative vanity mirror. A small, heavy-grade steel safe was permanently bolted to the concrete floor directly beneath the wooden bed frame, hidden entirely from casual view. Kosisochukwu did not suffer the restless, tossing, agonizing nights typical of a betrayed, discarded wife. Sleep was not a distant, reluctant stranger that needed to be desperately coaxed with heavy chemical medication or exhausted by hours of bitter, useless weeping. Instead, her sleep was incredibly deep and as cold as a drawn steel dagger. Her breathing remained perfectly, flawlessly rhythmic, even as she sat completely alone at her wooden desk at 3 a.m, examining the high-resolution digital photographs of bank checks and private ledgers. The profound psychological autopsy of her unnatural calm revealed a terrifying structural shift in her fundamental identity. The deeply painful emotional betrayal had entirely ceased to be a bleeding, festering wound. It had systematically calcified into a highly specific data point on a corporate ledger. A normal woman who is actively mourning the sudden catastrophic death of her marriage might lose her mind pacing the floors and questioning her own inherent worth. But a woman who is meticulously auditing a massive multi-million-dollar theft possesses the terrifying, unshakable clarity of a natural disaster. Kosisochukwu had completely detached her ego from the situation. She viewed Bamidele not as a heartbreakingly cruel husband, but as a severely over-leveraged, hostile corporate asset that needed to be aggressively and permanently liquidated. Chizoba, operating under Kosisochukwu's strict, uncompromising directives, became her invisible physical extension, operating seamlessly in the physical spaces. Kosisochukwu could no longer safely enter without drawing Bamidele's immediate suspicion. The younger sister moved silently through the massive estate exclusively during the dangerous hours when Bamidele was at the corporate office pretending to work, and Tolani was out aggressively spending his heavily borrowed money at the discussions. Luxury boutiques in town? Chizoba's heart would hammer violently against her ribs, a frantic somatic marker of her extreme anxiety, but she forced her hands to remain entirely perfectly steady. She infiltrated Bamidele's private home office, a room thick with the arrogant smell of imported Cuban cigars and expensive leather-bound books he never actually read. She carefully photographed highly confidential bank statements left carelessly on the polished dining table. She recorded hours of high-quality, crystal-clear audio of Madame Wuraola whispering urgently into her mobile phone while pacing in the shaded courtyard. She meticulously, precisely documented every single piece of gold jewelry, every authentic designer bag, and every physical electronic receipt that successfully passed through the active toll booth Wuraola had so successfully established. Right in the center of the family home, Every piece of data was quietly, securely uploaded to the encrypted server humming quietly in Kosisochukwu's guest room. By the end of the third exhausting week, Wuraola's blinding unchecked greed had successfully rapidly evolved from opportunistic occasional extortion into a highly efficient, relentless industrial operation. On a violently humid Thursday afternoon, exactly as the sun reached its absolute highest peak, Tolani arrived at the estate carrying a heavy, dark velvet box. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the red-baked earth beyond the high, secure estate walls, baking the harsh, acidic smell of dried cassava ferment into the thick, unmoving air. But inside the shaded private courtyard, the atmosphere was cool and artificially strictly regulated by the expensive imported palms. Tolani handed the velvet box directly to Wuraola without a single word. Inside, resting against the dark fabric, was a massive, intricate necklace of pure, solid 24-karat gold. It was heavy and undeniably cold against the older woman's calloused, grasping fingers. Wuraola's dark eyes gleamed with a raw, terrifying, predatory satisfaction. The physical weight of the gold acted as a somatic anchor for her massive delusion, making her believe she had finally achieved ultimate supreme power. She placed her hands firmly on Tolani's head and blessed her with elaborate, incredibly loud prayers, calling her the true, undeniable matriarch of the entire bloodline, and loudly promising that the legal divorce papers for the useless Kosisochukwu would be finalized and legally signed before the heavy rains completely stopped. Exactly 6 hours later, as the long dark evening shadows finally lengthened across the white marble of the grand driveway, the heavy iron security gates parted once again to admit Ihuoma. The second highly ambitious mistress did not bring physical, bulky jewelry. She brought the absolute digital confirmation of a massive, irreversible international wire transfer. The sharp, piercing electronic chime of Wuraola's mobile phone cut violently through the quiet, heavy air of the formal living room, directly signaling the successful arrival of the massive funds intended exclusively for the completely fictitious church ministry vehicle. Wuraola practically leapt from the velvet sofa. She aggressively embraced Ihuoma, pressing her sweating face directly against the younger woman's expensive imported silk blouse, repeating the exact same elaborate prayers and the exact same fraudulent promises of absolute domestic matriarchy she had just enthusiastically given to Tolani only a few hours before. The psychological autopsy of Madame Wuraola in this specific moment exposed a woman completely blinded by a lifetime of systemic deprivation. She truly, deeply believed she was a brilliant, untouchable mastermind, expertly manipulating the fragile strings of desperate, foolish women to single-handedly build a financial empire of her own design. She thought constantly of the dusty, rusted, corrugated roofs of her impoverished village, the persistent, inescapable smell of cheap wood smoke, and the decades of grinding, exhausting physical poverty. She smiled inwardly, believing she had finally decisively outsmarted the entire cruel world. She failed entirely and completely to realize the fragile, rapidly collapsing geometry of her own massive deceit. She was dangerously attempting to safely, securely occupy two entirely different aggressive realities, simultaneously making identical, exclusive promises to two highly ruthless women whose only shared human trait was their absolute blinding. Ambition. Wuraola confidently thought she was weaving a masterpiece of social deception, but she was merely enthusiastically constructing a very tall, very structurally unstable gallows entirely from the thick, heavy planks of her own avarice. Borrowed, stolen power always carries an exorbitant, hidden interest rate, and Wuraola was happily, aggressively borrowing against a violent, explosive future she did not legally, practically, or morally own. Months passed, and the dry season slowly, violently transitioned, bringing the heavy, relentless driving rains that aggressively washed the thick red dust from the expansive glass windows of the estate. Bamidele, drowning silently and invisibly in the massive, high-interest debt he had just proudly secured from the regional bank, decided it was time to physically, aggressively establish his supreme physical dominance. He needed a massive, undeniable physical monument to his perceived success and his unchecked virility. He contacted a high-end, exclusive luxury real estate brokerage located in the absolute most expensive center of the city to officially purchase an exclusive, sprawling penthouse apartment for Talani. He specifically demanded a space with sweeping, unobstructed panoramic views of the entire Asaba skyline, a place completely constructed of cold, imported Italian marble and floor-to-ceiling tempered glass where he could permanently today comfortably install his primary mistress far away from the prying, calculating eyes of his demanding mother and the silent, heavy judging presence of his completely discarded wife. He sat heavily in the plush, genuine leather chairs of the expansive brokerage office, drinking cold, imported, sparkling water and aggressively, proudly signing the final heavy deed of transfer with a thick, heavy gold pen. He felt the intense, intoxicating physical rush of absolute, undeniable control. He was a wealthy provider. He was an untouchable titan. He proudly handed over the massive official cashier's check, completely funding the multi-million naira purchase entirely with the borrowed, leveraged money he had carelessly collateralized against his fragile corporate shares. This is the exact moment the fundamental architecture of the dramatic irony achieved its absolute terrifying peak. What Bamidele could not possibly have known, what would have instantly violently stopped his heart dead in his chest had he bothered to look closely beyond the glossy, heavily edited marketing brochure, was the actual hidden corporate ownership structure of the firm he was sitting inside. The luxury brokerage firm was a direct, wholly owned subsidiary entity of Eagle Crest Industries, and Eagle Crest Industries was the massive primary asset management arm of Vanguard Horizon. The massive luxury penthouse he had just proudly purchased at an exorbitant, massive premium markup was a direct part of a highly lucrative residential portfolio owned entirely and legally by Kosisochukwu. Bamidele had just arrogantly, confidently taken a massive, toxic, high-interest bank loan, completely risking his entire professional corporate standing to literally buy a physical property from his own silent wife. He was literally enthusiastically paying massive monthly rent to the exact same woman he had callously left bleeding on the cold bathroom floor just so he could have a safe, luxurious place to comfortably sleep with his loud mistress. The money had simply moved from his severely leveraged debt account directly, cleanly, into Kosisochukwu's heavily fortified, impenetrable profit ledger. That exact same evening, back at the silent Asaba estate, Chizoba stood in the narrow, suffocating guest room, looking intently at the glowing digital copy of the official property deed that had just been securely automatically forwarded to Kosisochukwu's highly encrypted private server. Chizoba's hands were shaking violently, not from any kind of fear, but from a massive toxic excess of raw, unspent nervous energy. The physical heat climbed rapidly from her stiff cotton collar directly into her dark hairline, flushing her face with extreme anger. "How can you possibly just sit there?" Chizoba demanded, her voice a tight, venomous, aggressive hiss in the perfectly quiet room. He literally bought her a massive house. They are physically going to move their expensive things into it tomorrow morning. How can you just sit there and watch them openly celebrate while you are forced to sleep on this terrible, unyielding concrete mattress? Kosisochukwu did not immediately look up from the glowing digital screen. She slowly, calmly picked up her delicate imported porcelain teacup and took a slow, highly deliberate, perfectly measured sip. The warm, fragrant steam curled upward, slowly dissolving into the cold, highly conditioned air of the small room. She placed the delicate cup back on its perfectly matching saucer with a soft, definitive, metallic click that echoed loudly in the tense space. Her face was completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. She was not a wife looking at her husband's infidelity. She was a predator calmly watching a highly specific mechanism lock perfectly into place. "I hear you perfectly, Chizoba," she said, her quiet voice carrying the smooth, cold, steady, undeniable cadence of a mechanical metronome. I know exactly precisely what they are doing at this exact second. But you cannot successfully permanently burn down a massive house when the rats have not all completely safely gone inside yet. Chizoba fell completely silent, the tight, painful physical tension in her shoulders slowly, gradually dissolving as she looked closely at her older sister. The cold, terrifying words were not meant as a soothing emotional comfort. They were a strict, absolute strategic military doctrine. Kosisochukwu was not merely passively, weakly waiting for Bamidele to accidentally make a foolish mistake. She was actively, enthusiastically, brilliantly financing his complete, comprehensive self-destruction. She was laying out a very long, very expensive, thick golden carpet that led directly smoothly off a sheer, catastrophic cliff. Every single naira he arrogantly spent, every cruel, calculated insult he delivered, every single elaborate lie, Wuraola, spun to the desperate mistresses, was being perfectly flawlessly preserved, perfectly precisely catalogued, and perfectly timed for the inevitable, violent harvest. The trap was no longer just patiently set. The trap was completely, entirely full. The highly anticipated anniversary gala for the expansive mining division of Vanguard Horizon was meticulously designed from its very inception to be Bamidele's ultimate, undisputed public coronation as a supreme titan of modern industry. He had spared absolutely no expense, heavily utilizing the massive, toxic personal bank loan he had just arrogantly acquired. He had rented the entire grand ballroom of the most expensive and highly exclusive luxury hotel in the center of Asaba. A space so incredibly vast and intimidatingly ornate it seemed to possess its own distinct weather system. 300 hand-selected elite guests, wearing imported Swiss lace, heavily tailored Italian bespoke suits, and dripping in authentic diamond jewelry, filled the massive room. Waiters moving with military precision in pristine white cotton gloves circulated silently over the thick plush carpets carrying heavy crystal trays of imported vintage French champagne and delicate, expensive hors d'oeuvres. A 12-piece live jazz band played softly in the far, beautifully illuminated corner, establishing a thick, rich atmosphere of old generational money and untouchable corporate prestige. The central air conditioning was aggressively turned down to a frigid temperature, combating the natural heat of the hundreds of bodies, while the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of expensive, heavy designer colognes and thousands of fresh-cut imported white lilies completely masked any lingering trace of the humid tropical night waiting just beyond the thick tempered glass doors. Bamidele moved smoothly and confidently through the elegant, wealthy crowd, shaking hands with powerful regional politicians and casually accepting the fawning, desperate congratulations of his subordinate corporate directors. He truly, deeply believed he was standing at the absolute highest possible summit of human achievement. His custom-tailored dark navy suit fit him perfectly, expertly hiding the massive, unpayable, crippling financial debt he was currently carrying to fund this exact fraudulent lifestyle. He was operating entirely on the rapidly evaporating fumes of stolen corporate authority, but in his own deeply flawed mind, he was the untouchable architect of the entire commercial universe. Madame Wuraola was seated incredibly prominently at the highly decorated designated head table, positioned immediately to the right of Bamidele's currently empty oversized leather chair. Around her wrinkled dark neck, resting proudly and heavily against the dark, expensive fabric of her traditional tailored blouse, was the massive, solid 24-karat gold necklace Talani had desperately purchased just days prior. Wuraola was drinking expensive imported red wine and smiling aggressively at the passing wealthy guests, radiating the overwhelming toxic smugness of a woman who had successfully scammed her way into the absolute highest echelons of high society. Seated directly on Bamidele's other side, smiling triumphantly and delicately sipping from a tall, thin crystal flute, was Talani herself. She wore a stunning floor-length silver sequined designer gown that caught the heavy, bright light of the massive crystal chandeliers above her, completely believing that she had definitively, permanently won the ultimate prize. The three of them sat together at the absolute center of the massive room, a terrible, unholy trinity of breathtaking arrogance, bottomless greed, and absolute blinding delusion. They had carelessly built a fragile, glittering kingdom directly on the broken, bleeding back of a woman they foolishly assumed had simply vanished into quiet, pathetic submission. They did not understand the fundamental law of survival. A woman who walks away without making a single sound is not surrendering her territory. She is simply safely clearing the blast radius before the inevitable detonation. Uoma arrived at the massive grand ballroom precisely at 8 o'clock, exactly as the main courses were scheduled to be formally served. She wore a striking, deeply provocative crimson designer gown and walked confidently past the heavy private security detail, fully expecting to be immediately escorted to the central head table as the secretly honored and deeply revered primary guest. The heavy, distinctive scent of her signature expensive oud perfume trailed behind her, aggressively cutting through the delicate floral arrangements like a physical blade. She stepped into the main seating area, and her dark, calculating eyes immediately scanned the massive, crowded room for Bamidele. Instead, her sharp gaze locked instantly onto the brightly lit head table. She saw Bamidele standing nearby, laughing with a politician. She saw Talani sitting intimately close to his empty chair, wearing silver sequins and looking entirely too comfortable. And then the cold, horrifying, absolute reality of the situation rapidly crystallized as she looked directly at Madame Wuraola. Uoma instantly recognized the massive, solid gold necklace resting heavily on Wuraola's chest. She had seen similar pieces at the exact same jeweler where she had bought her own accessories. She recognized the smug, triumphant, deeply territorial smile on Talani's face. The massive luxury sports utility vehicle she had entirely funded with her own cash for the completely fictitious village church ministry suddenly materialized. In her mind, not as a holy spiritual offering to secure her future, but as the cruel, devastating punchline to an incredibly expensive, deeply humiliating joke. The physical heat climbed violently and rapidly from her stiff collar directly into her hairline, completely blinding her to the presence of the corporate audience and the highly elegant surroundings. The blood rushed violently in her ears, completely drowning out the soft, sophisticated jazz music. Her psychological state violently shifted from expectant entitlement to absolute homicidal rage. She did not ask for a quiet, discreet, mature conversation in the carpeted hallway. She did not care about the regional politicians, the wealthy board of directors, or the delicate social optics of the evening. Uoma crossed the polished marble floor, moving with the terrifying, unstoppable velocity of a completely derailed freight train. She reached the head table, ignoring the gasps of the nearby guests, and grabbed Madame Wuraola violently by the shoulder of her expensive traditional blouse. "Where is my money, you wicked old thieving witch?" Uoma screamed, her voice completely shattering the sophisticated, polite hum of the grand ballroom. "Where is the luxury car for the church ministry you lied about? You promised me his name. You took my money, and you gave my position to this cheap street girl." Talani instantly stood up aggressively, shoving Uoma forcefully backward to defend her newly acquired territory and her supposed highly lucrative future mother-in-law. "You are a completely mad, delusional woman," Talani shouted, aggressively pushing her own face directly into Uoma's personal space. "He bought me a massive luxury penthouse. He is legally marrying me next month. You are absolutely nothing but a desperate, aging beggar trying to steal my husband." Within exactly 3 seconds, the fragile, carefully curated, highly expensive illusion of polite high society completely and violently shattered. The physical fight erupted with the sudden, terrifying intensity of a gasoline fire. The three women were aggressively tearing at each other's highly expensive clothes right in the absolute center of the head table. Uoma slapped Talani across the face with devastating force. Talani grabbed a handful of Uoma's expensive hair extensions and pulled violently. Madame Wuraola, attempting to intervene to save her gold, was caught in the crossfire. A heavy decorated dining table forcefully overturned, sending dozens of imported porcelain plates crashing loudly to the hard floor. Fine, delicate crystal champagne flutes shattered against the marble, echoing sharply like scattered gunshots in the enclosed space. Thick red wine spilled across the pristine white table linens, looking exactly like fresh blood. Wuraola shrieked in absolute terror as Ihuoma aggressively grabbed the heavy, solid gold necklace around the older woman's neck and pulled with all her massive adrenaline-fueled strength. The heavy gold clasp snapped violently, sending thick, heavy pieces of pure 24-karat gold scattering randomly across the ruined carpet. Bamidele rushed forward, frantically waving his arms and shouting hysterically for the hotel security detail. His handsome, carefully moisturized face was completely slick with a terrifying cold sweat. His expensive, tailored suit was instantly rumpled. He was actively watching his entire, carefully constructed professional and personal reputation aggressively evaporate in real time, completely unable to physically separate the three screaming, fighting women who were rapidly, publicly destroying his entire life. The brutal, humiliating fight was not merely a physical altercation over a man. The psychological autopsy of this exact violent moment revealed it as the complete, inevitable, highly spectacular collapse of Bamidele's fraudulent architectural existence. He had built an entire life on the deeply flawed toxic premise that he could continuously safely control multiple women through aggressive intimidation and entirely empty financial promises. Now those exact same unfulfilled promises were violently tearing his world apart directly in front of his entire wealthy board of directors and highly judgmental industry peers. A foolish, arrogant man who enthusiastically builds his massive house entirely with stolen, unbaked bricks should never act surprised when the heavy walls finally cave in and completely crush him. Then the heavy mahogany double doors, at the absolute back of the grand ballroom, forcefully opened. Kosisochukwu walked slowly and deliberately into the chaotic room. She was not wearing a glamorous sequined gown or heavy imported lace. She wore a completely simple, perfectly tailored dark black business suit that aggressively communicated absolute, lethal authority. She was closely flanked on her right side by Barrister Akintola, the absolute most deeply feared and highly respected corporate litigator in all of Lagos, and on her left side by a formal team of 4 forensic financial auditors heavily carrying thick, authentic leather binders. The chaotic, loud conversation in the massive ballroom instantly violently stopped. The 12-piece live jazz band abruptly ceased playing mid-measure, the sudden absence of music ringing loudly in the ears. The white-gloved waiters froze completely still, holding their silver trays suspended in midair. Even the 3 angry women, scrambling and aggressively tearing at each other on the ruined floor, froze their bleeding hands, still firmly gripping torn, expensive silk and scattered broken gold. The heavy silence that descended was not polite. It was suffocating. It was the absolute terrifying physical vacuum of a massive room that had just collectively realized the breathable air was entirely gone. Barrister Akintola did not speak to the gathered wealthy crowd. He did not introduce himself. He walked with military precision directly to the nervous audiovisual technician standing frozen at the side of the main stage and handed over a highly encrypted silver flash drive. Exactly 10 seconds later, the massive digital projector screen positioned directly behind the ruined head table illuminated the dark room with a blinding white light. The massive screen publicly displayed the highly confidential master deed of incorporation for Vanguard Horizon. The sole absolute legal ownership name listed clearly in bold, undeniable black ink was Kosisochukwu. The next slide immediately displayed the formal legal termination of Bamidele's executive employment contract, entirely effective immediately, citing gross financial negligence and massive unauthorized capital diversion. The third massive slide publicly displayed the official legal deed to the luxury Skyline Penthouse, definitively proving that Kosisochukwu entirely legally owned the very roof Bamidele had just deeply mortgaged his entire financial life to temporarily rent. The warm, natural color left Bamidele's face exactly the way artificial light leaves a room when someone violently flips a main circuit breaker. It did not happen gradually. It happened all at once. His hand, which was still aggressively reaching out to physically stop the women from fighting, dropped heavily and uselessly to his side. His knees locked painfully. His jaw fell open, but absolutely no sound emerged from his dry throat. His entire reality, his entire fabricated masculine identity was completely instantly deleted. He was not a billionaire CEO. He was merely a severely over-leveraged, unemployed tenant who had just been handed a massively public, humiliating eviction notice directly in front of the entire corporate world. His cognitive functions completely shut down, completely unable to process the absolute scale of his own self-inflicted destruction. Madame Wuraola, sitting on the floor, slowly read the massive projected legal documents through her reading glasses. Her aging knees gave out completely permanently. She slumped heavily backward until she hit the wet carpeted floor, sitting entirely helplessly among the broken, shattered champagne glasses, the spilled red wine, and the ruined expensive catering. The heavy, solid gold necklace she had so enthusiastically bled and lied for was now just a broken, useless chain scattered on the floor, mocking her immense greed. Tolani and Ihuoma, breathing heavily, their expensive hair completely ruined, stared up at the massive projected financial documents and then slowly, painfully looked back at Bamidele. The horrifying, devastating realization hit them both with massive, undeniable physical force. The arrogant man they were actively, violently bleeding for did not own the massive mining company. He did not legally own the sprawling Asaba estate. He was currently holding tens of millions of naira in toxic, unpayable, high-interest personal debt, and he possessed absolutely legally nothing of actual liquid value. They had fought a brutal, humiliating public war over a completely empty, bankrupt throne. Their entire transactional reality instantly dissolved, leaving them with nothing but public shame. Kosisochukwu did not move a single inch from her position near the entrance. Her steady hands remained loosely, gracefully folded at her waist, exactly identically as they had been when he had cruelly insulted her while she was bleeding on the freezing bathroom floor all those long, agonizing months ago. Her deep, rhythmic breathing did not change. Her beautiful face was utterly, entirely blank. She did not smile triumphantly. She did not gloat loudly. She did not offer any dramatic emotional monologue to the crowd. She simply looked directly at Bamidele with the cold, absolute clinical detachment of a senior auditor reviewing a completely, hopelessly bankrupt ledger. He stared helplessly back at her, his chest heaving violently, his terrified, wide eyes begging desperately silently for a private conversation, a second chance, a shred of mercy that she would absolutely never, ever grant him. "I told you," Kosisochukwu said, her voice completely calm, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of any anger, effortlessly carrying through the dead, heavy silence of the massive ballroom. "I have always known everything." The brutal aftermath of the evening was incredibly swift, legally absolute, and completely devoid of any emotional mercy. Bamidele was aggressively, physically escorted from the luxury hotel property by his own former corporate security guards, who now answered exclusively to his wife. He spent that exact night sleeping uncomfortably in his imported car parked on a dark street. The regional bank manager, having sent discreet representatives who personally witnessed the highly public corporate termination, immediately and aggressively called in the massive toxic personal loan Bamidele had so arrogantly taken for the luxury penthouse. Without his exorbitant executive corporate salary to safely cover the crushing daily interest payments, his personal bank accounts were completely, entirely frozen within exactly 48 hours. The imported car he was sleeping in was forcefully repossessed by the bank by the end of the week, leaving him standing entirely alone on the side of a dusty road with nothing but the expensive tailored suit he was currently wearing. Tolani and Ihuoma vanished instantly, entirely returning to the dark anonymous shadows of the city, immediately recognizing a sinking ship and leaving Wuraola with absolutely nothing but the torn, ruined clothes she was actively wearing. The older woman, completely stripped of her entirely fraudulent matriarchal power, was forced to immediately return to the rusted, corrugated roofs of her impoverished village. She was forced to rely entirely on the bitter, highly conditional charity of the exact same distant relatives she had previously loudly mocked and aggressively extorted for years. She would spend the rest of her miserable life smelling cheap wood smoke and remembering the brief, heavy weight of stolen gold. Kosisochukwu returned calmly and confidently to the massive corporate headquarters in Ota. She took her rightful legal seat at the absolute head of the long, polished mahogany boardroom table. She did not need to raise her steady voice to instantly command the absolute respect of the nervous directors. True, undeniable power had finally cleanly returned to its original brilliant source. It had never really truly left. It had merely been resting. The profound moral absolute of the universe had been aggressively, violently restored. Money had not defeated Bamidele. Kosisochukwu's endless, terrifying, flawless patience had simply allowed him the necessary time and the abundant rope to completely enthusiastically defeat himself. A kingdom violently built on the forced silence of a deeply good woman will always absolutely fall the exact precise moment she finally logically decides to speak. True love, completely, entirely devoid of foundational respect, is not a marriage. It is merely a highly decorated maximum security prison. And Kosisochukwu had finally burned her prison to the absolute ground. If this story reached you, share it with one woman in your life who needs to hear it. Not for me, for her. Because every woman you know is carrying a story she has never told. And somewhere in this one, maybe you heard the beginning of hers. Subscribe only if you intend to stay. This channel is not for passing traffic. It is for women who know that patience is a weapon, silence is a strategy, and the truth, given enough time, always finds the door.